So first of all, we've got Hannah Price to come and talk to us about bullying and harassment in gynaecology. Hannah's an O&G trainee in Wessex, and she's currently working as a gynae-oncology fellow alongside her role in RCOG Surgical Skills Fellow. And in this role, she's leading on the national agenda to improve surgical skills and training for all O&G doctors. She's undertaken an MD in surgical simulation and is the current Vice Chair for Education on the National Trainees Committee. So it's my pleasure to welcome her to the stage. Thank you.
Brilliant. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all this morning. And I'm starting us off with a really cheery topic of workplace behaviours in gynae-oncology, and telling you a little bit about the survey that we undertook last year to find out what's going on within our community. So, workplace behaviour. Well, poor workplace behaviour ranges from incivility to bullying to harassment. And incivility are those low-level behaviours with ambiguous intent to harm. What does that actually mean? Well, it means that when you're like sat in MDT and you kind of catch someone rolling their eyes out the corner of your eye, it's when you're talking to someone and they just subtly start to freeze you out of the conversation. It's those sorts of behaviours that person may not even know that they're doing, but that still have an impact on you. We all know what bullying is. That's repeated behaviour that is intentional. It is that person knows that they are causing harm and they are doing it anyway. And harassment is when that behaviour is directed against a protected characteristic, so something like gender or race or ability. Now, we're in a pretty dire situation in the NHS. So 1 in 3 healthcare professionals experience bullying in the workplace. It costs us a lot of money, £2.28 billion annually, due to sickness, due to attrition, needing to replace new doctors. And that's not including the fact that in civil doctors also, there's research that they get sued more as well. So it costs us money. And around about 17% of NHS employees felt bullied in the workplace in 2023. And actually that figure has stayed relatively stable over around the past sort of 5 to 10 years. So what we wanted to do as a BDCS is evaluate what our workplace behaviours were like in gynae-oncology, and also have a look at what our burnout levels were like and what our psychological safety was like within our teams, and use that data to provide some insights into our own culture and look at ways that we can start to improve it. So what we did was send out an online survey using Microsoft Forms. We did it around about this time last year, so it was open from early October to the middle of November, and we got 118 responses, which is just under a fifth of our entire BGCS community, which is not bad for these types of surveys. And around about a fifth of respondents were yourselves, unit leads. So what were our results? Well, 36% of respondents were subspecialty gynae-oncology consultants, 14% were CNSs, and about 11% were subspecialty trainees. But actually, we got around half of the subspecialty trainees in the country filling in the survey. About 74% of our respondents were women, which does reflect the sort of trend in O&G at the time. And 70% of our respondents were of British ethnicity. So what did we find out? Well, the first questions we asked were about burnout. Now, burnout is that feeling of complete and utter exhaustion, be that emotional, physical, mental, due to chronic stress. And for most of us, that's due to workplace stress. But it can also be because of caregiving, of parenting, lots and lots of reasons. And the phrase comes from an American psychologist, I believe, who saw buildings in his city being sort of burnt out, but they looked fine from the outside. But on the inside, they were just crumbling and smoke and flames, and there's nothing there. So people with burnout seem like they're functioning on the outside, but on the inside, they're utterly, utterly exhausted. So why does it matter? Why does burnout matter to the NHS? Well, 50% of us are more likely to experience chronic stress contributing to burnout. We are particularly high risk of burnout in healthcare. And a lot of the research shows that burnout in other professions is due to the fact that there's a misalignment in values. So the work that you're doing doesn't align with your values. Whereas actually in healthcare, it's almost the opposite. We're so highly aligned that it almost adds fuel to the fire. It's like one surgeon described it as it's being like on a roller coaster and not being able to get off. It's just getting faster and faster. The demand is always there. There's always more to be done. And it just gathers momentum. And he didn't know where the break was. He couldn't find it. So we are particularly high risk in healthcare. I would argue that we're even more high risk in obs and gynae, and probably even more high risk in gynae oncology, because we manage cancer patients as well. And there's that worry that actually if we don't do the best that we can, if we don't see that extra patient, then that's a cancer patient, and that's not a good thing. So 31% of NHS employees have had to take time off work with mental health issues in the last few years. We know that almost half of NHS employees are looking for work outside of the NHS, and we know that burnout leads to symptoms such as feeling exhaustion, but also things like compassion fatigue. And as I started sort of looking into this literature more for this work, I could see it in myself. At the 5th, 6th clinic in 3 days, I wasn't the same compassionate doctor as I was at that first clinic on a Monday morning. And yes, I could recognise it and try and put some steps in place, but there's only so much you can do. So what were our findings from a burnout side of things? Well, not good. So a lot of us feel that every working day is tiring. A lot of us are exhausted in the morning at the thought of coming in for another day of work. Almost 70% of us feel worn out at the end of a working day, and almost 80% of us find our work emotionally exhausting. And for our subspecialty trainees, well, they were higher in every single category. So we have got obs and gynae trainees and subspecialty trainees coming into starting their consultant life already burnt out. How do we compare? Not great. So we use the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory questions that are used in the trainee evaluation form that's run through the RCOG, that's also used in the NHS staff survey, so we could do a direct comparison of responses. And when we compared our responses to the previous year's NHS staff survey, we scored higher in almost every category. We were the same in feeling that every working hour was tiring for us, but in everything else, we almost doubled the responses in some of those questions. So yes, the NHS is at risk of burnout. Healthcare workers are particularly at risk of burnout, but we are in particular high risk of burnout within our specialty. So why did I ask about burnout when starting a questionnaire on poor workplace behaviour? How do the two align? Well, it's because of this. So I do some work with Civility Saves Lives. I would very much recommend having a little look at their website or looking at their founder Chris Turner's talks on the topic. They're really, really good. But essentially one of the things that they have spoken about is that most of us come into medicine to be a good person, and we have aspirations of helping people and doing good. And that's how we start. And then all of these external stressors within our NHS systems happen to us. We then work in a permissive environment. So we work in a culture in our theatres, in our MDTs, where actually, in general, it's acceptable to be in civil. Nobody really calls it out. We take it, it's part of our culture. And that's what we need to start thinking about changing. But that's how we generate in civil clinicians. Most of us aren't psychopaths. There may be one or two, but most of us start a good person. And actually, it's everything that's going on around us that leads us to become incivil. And even like me, I have read so much of this literature, and I am still guilty of being incivil when I am stressed, when I'm presented with the same CTG for the 5th time on a night shift. I have snapped. I now try and say sorry. I now try and do it less. But we are all guilty of showing these behaviours. And it's what we've learned by growing up in this culture. But why does poor workplace behaviour matter? Well, there's been so much research. There's two academic professors over in the States, Christine Porath and Catherine Pearson, that have done so much work on the effect of incivility, rudeness, bullying within the workplace. And a lot of that has been done within healthcare. And we know from that research that if someone is incivil to you, is rude to you, it reduces your bandwidth by 60%. It literally makes you 60% less of who you are, less of a person. And when I read that, I was like, nah, not me. I can brush it off. Like, I'm okay, I've got thick skin. And then I remember going into theatre a little while after this and being with a surgeon who's one of those that we're all like, yeah, he's just like that, don't let it affect you. He does shout. He sometimes throws things, it's not about you. And I remember being in that position, having been shouted at, and physically feeling myself getting smaller, like my body was doing this to try and sort of not be shouted at next. So I had, in that moment, become less of a person because of those behaviours. And the other thing that gets me is when Chris Turner speaks about this, he talks about the fact that you may have an episode of incivility, maybe in team brief, maybe when the parking attendant wouldn't let me into the car park the first thing the other morning and was very rude to me. And at that time, I let it go and I got on with my day. And I was a bit like, oh, God, what a annoying person. That's not the words I used at the time, but got on with my day. And I don't think any mistakes happened during that day. There may have been that I'm not aware of. But then I got in my car at the end of the day, 12 hours later, after a long theatre list, and I was still thinking about that rude parking attendant that morning. And that's when I came up with the really witty reply of what I should have said at that time. Because at that time, he made me less of a person. He made me not witty. But 12 hours later, I'm really, really witty. But that's because I'd had time to come back to myself. I was back in my car, I was back in a safe place, and actually that was when I became myself again after that episode of rudeness. But I'd carried that throughout my day, and that had clearly had some impacts on my ability to manage my patients and the theatre list that day. I functioned, nothing bad happened, I don't think, but it did affect me. And it affects us all. So 80% of us lose time worrying about the rudeness. Clearly, in my case, we reduce our time at work, we take it out on service users, and in our position, that is our patients. And it's not just those that are affected by the incivility themselves, it's everybody else in that environment that witnesses it, be it in theatre, in your MDT. We've all seen it happen. If that surgeon shouts at their SHO or that reg, everybody else in theatre takes a step back, don't they? And they all start looking at the floor like it's the most attractive thing they've ever seen in their entire lives, because they don't want to be the next person to get shouted at. And it doesn't take much to think about what that means for if they pick up something about patient safety or something that they think has been missed. They're far more unlikely to share that information if they're looking at the floor and just don't want to be shouted at next. So how were we doing? Well, we asked 20 questions within the online survey, and 78% of respondents had experienced at least one poor workplace behaviour in the last 12 months, just in 12 months. The most common behaviours within our specialty are persistent attempts to belittle and undermine our work, freezing out, ignoring and excluding, and undue pressure to produce work. And 33% of respondents had experienced discrimination in the workplace in the last 12 months. So who are the bad guys? Who's dealing out this behaviour? Well, we asked. So for our gynae-oncology consultants, it was gendered to be other consultants in their department, their clinical directors, their hospital managers. For our subspecialty trainees, it tended to be the consultants, either in their own department or another department. And for our CNSs, it was consultants or subspecialty trainees. But essentially, the answer is all of us. All of us are guilty of being incivil to each other at some point. Even if we're the best person in the world, I'm sure that there have been times when you've been a bit snappy, that you've slightly frozen someone out, that you've maybe unintentionally belittled someone. And that's what we need to start changing. I also did some further analysis of our results and found that ethnic minorities experience higher percentage rates in 19 out of the 20 questions. Women experience higher rates in 17 out of 20, and our subspecialty trainees also experience higher rates of these behaviours in 18 out of 20 items. For our subspecialty trainees, they experience far more of each of the most popular, that sounds like the wrong word, but behaviours that were being experienced, and there was only 2 responses of physical violence, one physical violence, 1 against property, and both of those were directed against our subspecialty trainees, which is awful. How are we doing compared to the rest of our NHS population? I don't know whether this is sad or reassuring, but about the same. So we took these questions directly from a junior doctor survey that was undertaken about 20 years ago. And actually our responses for the percentage of poor workplace behaviour that was experienced by our gynae-oncology community and junior doctors working across the country at that time was fairly similar. But that also means that nothing's really changed in 20 years, despite us knowing about this data, despite us knowing more about the effects of civility on us and on our patients. So the final thing we asked about in the survey was about team psychological safety. And this is starting to become something that's talked about more commonly in the literature. It's definitely gaining momentum. It wasn't actually a thing until Amy Edmondson discovered it in around about the sort of 2000 sort of millennium sort of times. So over the last 20 years, this is really starting to gain some traction. But what is team psychological safety? Well, it is the ability to take interpersonal risks in your team. What's that actually mean? Well, I remember as a little ST1, sat between the legs, where all the best ST1s are, being in an operation where we'd removed 2 specimens, I think it was a BSO or something, and we'd removed one of the specimens. And I remember sitting there thinking, that specimen's still in that abdomen. And I remember thinking, I'm not going to say anything. Like, they know. They're way more... I had a consultant at an ST7. They'll know that it's still there. It's not for me to say. And they kept going, and I was like, they still haven't taken it out. That's a bit weird, but I probably just don't know what's going on. And I don't want to look a bit stupid. I don't want to step out of line. I'll let them... They'll carry on. They'll take it out. And then they started taking the ports out, and I was like, oh, okay, no, they have actually forgotten. And at that point, I did step up and say, have we got the other specimen? Shall we just check? But that entire process beforehand, I was assessing my psychological safety within that room in order to speak up and say, hey, I think I've seen something that you guys have missed. And in that time, I was assessing whether actually the risk of me being shouted at, the risk of me looking stupid, in that immediate moment outweighed the risk to the patient of having a specimen that was still left inside. And we are human beings at the end of it, and we are social beings, and we know from the research that actually that risk to ourselves of looking silly, of being shouted at, we weigh much higher, and actually it is really hard to put ourselves out there sometimes and take that interpersonal risk to speak out, to disagree with someone, to do all of these things, to admit to errors, admit when we've made mistakes, ask difficult questions, ask for help. So in that time, I was assessing my psychological safety to speak out in that situation. And that is when that consultant had already told me off for being such a girl a few weeks before. They were white, senior males. All of that stuff plays into that mix of how psychologically safe I felt in that environment. And I remember the ST7 at the time, who's now a good consultant friend, saying, oh, why didn't you say something sooner? And I wished I'd gone, well, I was actually assessing my psychological safety within this environment, but I was an ST1 and I didn't have a clue. And I think I just laughed it off. But it just goes to show that actually his assessment of psychological safety within that theatre that he'd been working in for a while had lots of more experience than I did. He was white and a male, so his assessment of psychological safety in that setting was far different to mine and my experiences at that time. So it's just being aware of that difference. So that's kind of what psychological safety is. It's that ability to feel safe in an MDT, to disagree with someone and know that that's not going to be carried forward. Know that you are safe to have that healthy discussion. It's when you can admit to errors so that you can all learn from them. So the way that psychological safety was actually discovered, if that's the right term, was in healthcare settings. So Amy Edmondson put together a research proposal where she went and researched healthcare teams, and she thought, bad teams, more errors. Makes sense, right? What she actually found when she did the analysis was that good teams had more errors. And she was like, what is going on here? And then she had a light bulb moment, and she was like, actually what's happening is that good team feels safe to report more errors. They discuss it. They have a learning environment, a culture where it's okay to admit to them. And that's why they had more errors. And that's where psychological safety started off from us in healthcare. So psychological safety feeds into a lot of different things within our culture. It aids with employee engagement, it promotes an inclusive culture, which we all want, it generates creative ideas for change, it encourages creativity, because we all know that our brains don't work well in fear. Back in the day when we were on construction lines and we were just doing sort of monotonous robotic tasks, fear might have worked as a leadership culture. But it doesn't when we need to use our brains. And that's what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. We're all scientists. We know that fear shuts down our amygdala. We know the effects it has. So it doesn't work. And there's lots of research to back that up. And we know that it improves employee well-being and feeds into what I was talking about earlier about burnout as well. And Amy Edmondson actually took this a little bit further. And Because she was talking about psychological safety, and the common criticism that she came across was, well, if we're nice to everybody, then we're not going to get anything done. Everyone's just going to float into work, do what they want to do, and float home again. And I've come across those criticisms as well. Actually, you can have high psychological safety and still have high standards, and that's what we really need to be striving for. And she created this graph comparing psychological safety on one axis and performance standards on the other. And I would argue that in gynae-oncology in general, we tend to fall in the high performance standards area of this graph. So really our choice is whether we have high psychological safety or low psychological safety. And if you think about those times when you were a trainee, or me as a trainee, when you have come out of theatre buzzing, when you've had those days where you're like, yes, this was the day, I learnt loads, I had a great day, this is why I do the job that I do. I would bet good money that actually you had that surgeon, that mentor, had high standards for you. They wanted you to know the patients, have seen them pre and post-op, have done some simulation before. They set that bar quite high. They expected from you. But they also created an environment of high psychological safety where you could learn, where you felt safe to ask questions, even if you felt it was a little bit silly to ask, where you were able to just push yourself that little bit further, where you felt safe to do that. So they created that learning zone for you, and that is what our trainees so desperately need when it's actually really challenging to learn surgical skills in our current environment. It's why I've got a job with the college. So our other option is to have low psychological safety. And we've all been in those situations where the surgeon shouts at you, where they throw stuff around, where they're rude to you, where they don't bother to learn your name. And actually that puts people into the anxiety zone, and that is going to feed into burnout. And that is going to make things really unpleasant for our trainees and for everybody else around us. I'm using a theatre setting because it's the way my brain maps onto this the easiest, but it's true in MDTs as well. It's true in all of our different teams. The other options, if we have slightly lower performance standards and high psychological safety, we have a lovely day. We have maybe a nice hysteroscopy list and have a wonderful time, but we've not learned, we've not been pushed, we've not been driven. And the apathy zone, where both standards and safety are low, those are the days where you come in, you don't particularly maybe respect the person you're working with, they don't have high standards, they don't expect anything from you, and you just put your head down, get through the day, and that's all that you can ask of it. So how are we doing with our psychological safety? Well, we could be better. 23% do not feel that their unique skills are valued and utilised as part of their teams. 19% feel that their team deliberately undermine their efforts. You can read 34% felt unsafe to take risks, and risk-taking is challenging in our environment. I'm not necessarily saying we should all take loads of risks, but actually change is a risk. Progress is a risk. 24% feel rejected by their team for being different. We can do so much better than this. And our subspecialty trainees generally had higher response rates in all of those different areas as well. We also asked some free text comments as part of the survey, and some of the comments will genuinely stay with me for life. There were some awful examples of sexual harassment within those comments that I haven't shared here, but there was also a lot of people talking about the devastating effects that these behaviours have had on their self-worth, on their self-esteem, their ability to enjoy their job, to have a good work-life balance, their sense of imposter syndrome, the fact that female trainees don't feel like they're supported within this community. We didn't specifically ask for recommendations as part of this survey. That will be some of the work that we are taking forward off the back of this. But some people suggested some anyway. So they wanted us to increase awareness and provide clearer guidelines on what is acceptable within our BGCS community, what are our values. And we've developed a subgroup that is particularly looking at this, and the first thing that we are doing is outlining exactly that. What are our values as a BGCS community? What is acceptable behaviour? What is unacceptable behaviour? And how to cope, or how to manage if you are a victim, if you're a perpetrator. That work is in progress at the moment. They wanted us to foster psychological safety and address the stigma about talking about it, and standardise clinician-to-patient ratios to help address those concerns around burnout. So I'm a fan of a QR code. I'm also a fan of picking people's brains, and I have you all here. As I said, we have a subgroup that's looking at this, and I would really like to know what you guys think. So what would help you from your trusts, from the BGCS, to address burnout, to address psychological safety, to address poor workplace behaviours? If you have any ideas, anything that's worked well, what we do good as well within your trust, let me know through this code, and I would love to help feed that into the group to take this forward. If you are interested, I'm very pleased to say that this work has now been published in the International Journal of Gynecological Cancer, and this is a very pretty infographic that they've made for us. So all of the stats, all of the graphs, all of the analysis that's in this survey is in that paper, if you do want to refer back to it. And if listening to me talk about it today has not quite been enough, the RCOG Surgical Skills Project does have our own podcast, and this particular episode here is talking about incivility in theatre, where we do talk a little bit more about it. Most things that I have learned about incivility, about workplace behaviour, have come from these two books here. I haven't read them, I've listened to them on Spotify on my commute, because that's how I can manage taking it in. So they are available on Spotify. And also You Are Not a Frog is a brilliant podcast that talks about burnout and coping strategies, particularly for healthcare practitioners. Rachel, who runs it, is a previous GP and talks to a lot of clinicians about these things. So, I can see Amy hovering. In conclusion, there are significantly high levels of burnout in gynae-oncology. Healthcare professionals are at high risk. Obs and gynae is at high risk. We actually beat the general surgeons in our burnout levels, but I'm not sure we should be proud of that. And I think we are the highest risk within our specialty in gynae-oncology as well. We need to stop belittling, undermining and freezing out people. These are our most common behaviours. And Google and lots of research has shown that the most effective teams are the most psychologically safe teams. And we have shown that there are some areas for improvement that we have within our community. We very much will be taking this work forward as a BGCS. Please do come and talk to me about it if you have any ideas, anything that's worked well. I love talking about this stuff. And if you do want to email me, this is my email address here. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I'm going to start with the first question.
Okay.
Okay. So there is some talk about whether we should be, if we see this kind of behaviour, we should be stepping in and saying something at the time, and highlighting it. Can you give me your opinion on whether you think that's a good idea and whether it works?
So within Civility Saves Lives, this is a conversation that we do have quite a lot, and it's definitely something that we are continuing to learn about. It's really difficult for an individual to call out behaviour against themselves, and actually that's not often the right thing to do. It's often better if someone else can call that behaviour out for them. Whether we call it out at the time or at a separate time, it's probably better to call it out at a separate time if that's possible. And there's a whole, on the RCOG website, we have a whole workplace behaviours toolkit, and Chris Turner talks about sort of calling it out with compassion. So, for example, if an anaesthetist is rude to a surgeon or a trainee and you don't think that's acceptable, finding a time during that day when you're not being watched by everyone else, taking that anaesthetist aside and just being like, actually, you've really upset my trainee. I didn't know whether you were aware. Is there something going on? Is there something that we can help with? Like, what's happening? What's your side to the story? But also, this isn't acceptable. And protecting our trainees, protecting each other. And for some people, they might go, oh my God, I'm really sorry. I didn't realise. Actually, my cat died this morning and I'm taking it out on everybody else. And actually, you've nipped it in the bud and you've called it out. If they do know what they're doing, it's also really annoying if they get pulled aside every single list to be asked whether they're okay. And we're changing that culture, we're changing that norm, that permissive environment that I spoke about. We're actually saying in quite a gentle, calm way, actually that behaviour is not acceptable, but we're not making a scene, we're not escalating. And that is currently the general consensus within this particular Civility Saves Lives community of people that are interested in that. But I would say that we are still learning and developing as this science grows and evolves. Is that an okay answer, Amy?
Thank you. Can you tell me something about has rota design affected this civility and bullying scenarios?
Yes. I think it has affected everything within our community. I think the lack of team structure means that we just aren't able to build those relationships in the same way that we once were. And that has affected our civility to each other. It's definitely affected surgical skills training with my other hat on, and developing those skills that are so desperately needed. The problem is that we can't go back. We're not going to be able to magic up team structure the way it was 10, 20 years ago. I wish we could, but it's just not going to happen. So we need to find new and innovative ways to create that team structure, to create those relationships in the setting that we're currently in. And some of that is about change, some of that is about trying new designs within our rota, and some of it is about how do we build those relationships with each other quicker and in the environment that we're in. I wish we could go back, but we can't.
Thank you. I'm Lars Gift. I'm a consultant in Durham, and I really did enjoy that talk.
Thank you.
Just a couple of points you're making. For instance, when you're not afraid to speak out, I don't know if you've heard of a Tenerife air disaster in the late 1970s, where two jumbo jets crashed into each other, and it was the worst civil aviation accident ever. And the precipitating factor was the captain of one KLM. The pilot was one of the most senior pilots in the organization. He was asked to investigate all sorts of stuff. And after the crash, they were actually looking for him to lead the investigation, but he was dead. When they analyzed a voice recorder from a cockpit, it turned out his co-pilot, everyone else was saying to him, should we stop here? And he just overruled him, said, don't tell me what to do. And what happened, the two planes crashed into each other. And that changed a lot of airline standards completely to make voices change up. The other thing, extension, and I'm not proud of this, in our trust, what you were talking about, being able to speak out, being able to raise issues, has resulted in our chief executive, chairman of a trust, and the entire board of directors and medical director all being sacked within the last few weeks by Jim Mackey, the chairman of the NHS Trust. And it was issues like this was raised repeatedly. Issues also such as people were frightened to talk about things, speak out, and ended up because they felt they were being victimized, and etc. Going back to a team structure, one of the problems of a team structure, being a trainee from the late 80s and 90s, it's all very well having a team structure, but if you're the person who's the subject to all the criticism in that team, it isn't great fun at all. But that was a really good talk, and I really enjoyed it.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.